When humanity finally left its cradle on the third planet of the Sol sector, it began to stretch out to each of the stars. This was nothing new. All sentient species did this, and they usually colonized the nearest planets they could, those which they could survive on. What surprised everyone was the fact that humans had a strange way of colonizing. They would stretch out with large ships that were armed to the teeth with all sorts of weaponry as they made their way to the planet and then land the ship on the planet, knowing full well that they could never take off again. This was odd. However, as we watched, humans began to build great cities through these ships, as the ships would open up vents and do what they needed to, as they called it, terraform said planet into an M-class planet. This would make it more than sustainable for human life, but also for others as well. Humans preferred to do this to each of the planets, no matter how unforgiving the atmosphere was. In some cases, there wasn't even an atmosphere, and they still colonized the planet, still preferring to go out in their suits, however, still using these massive warships to land on the planet and use them as a base of operation. This surprised us and confused everyone, as we didn't understand why the humans would need such a massive vessel with such large weapons, and why they would simply land it on the planet and use it and not just release their shuttles to colonize the planet at large. So we sat and we watched. We watched the humans spread out with each of these ships to each of their planets, each of the planet's satellites in their sector. And when they were done, they had finally reached out beyond their sector to at least one sector in every single direction, and colonized at minimum one planet on each one, and 2 separate satellites. It was around this time that the galactic community at large introduced themselves fully to the humans. We'd found out that some of the species had done backdoor deals with the humans, as they call it. Still not sure what that means, but we're pretty sure that it meant something against galactic law. This, at first, gave us a reason why the humans had spread so far, so fast, in such a short amount of time. In fact, once the humans had achieved spaceflight and were able to start mining minerals out of their own asteroid belt, then the production of these massive ships went up tenfold, and it only took one of their years, a solar rotation around the sun, to create one. Their autonomous robots would go into the asteroid field, mine it for whatever they needed, breaking the chunks down into smaller pieces, then bringing the chunks back to large space stations, which they were smelted down and formed into whatever materials they needed to build it. Then the same type of drones would simply take the pieces and build the ship next to the space station. This whole process, as stated before, ended up taking about a year. Eventually, they moved some of these stations even closer to the asteroid belt, and production got even faster with these large ships. It became noted that each of these ships was strange to us, more so than you would think, as they were much more than colonization ships. We still didn't understand why these ships needed such powerful weapons on them. We scanned each of them, and though we could not get through their hull, it was easy to see the type of weapons they had. Many different ports for weapons, direct fire weapons, that is. Many point defense weapons for incoming materials. And what was either a spot for missiles and torpedoes to be launched, or for escape pods. But it was difficult for us to tell which one was which. This being said, it was not until the humans had finally reached the edge of the borders that we would allow them to, as it is galactic standard to allow each species to go one sector beyond their home before any type of stance is against them. We told them that they must stop, and they cannot start colonizing these empty worlds. The humans didn't listen, and simply said, "You did not colonize this planet, which means it's free to colonize." We warned them that this was against our laws, And the humans simply said, "It's not against ours. We were here first. If you wanted this planet so bad, you should have colonized it." When we informed them that we were going to colonize them, even though it would take approximately 10,000 of their years to do so, they simply stated, "In 10,000 years, we'll have an entire population." We could not abide by this, as reaching into someone else's territory is an unofficial declaration of hostilities. So, the first central species to engage the humans decided to take back this one simple colony. They arrived at the planet. The Aragna came across the planet and simply stated for the humans that they had to leave. They didn't have a choice. The humans responded, "We do not negotiate with terrorists." The Aragna stated back, "We are not negotiating. You will leave or you will die. You have 24 of your hours." At that point, the human warship, as we thought it was landed on the planet and simply used as a base of operation, began to ignite its engines once again and lift it off the planet. The Aragna didn't understand, how could something so massive be able to lift off a planet so easily? The ship turned its nose towards the outer atmosphere and scorched the planet beneath it, just about destroying every single structure that was in the general area as it boosted its way out of the atmosphere. The Aragna ships did not wait, and they began to fire on the human battleship as it just became orbital. It barely scratched the paint. The human battleship began to unleash with all sorts of salvos of weapons. It never changed the direction or pitch of the direction it was going. The weapons simply rotated and began to fire. Massive amounts of metal were launched out at speeds almost unbelievable, at a high percentage of the speed of light. Other weapons came out, missiles, torpedoes, even the point defense systems, if they were close enough, began to fire back at the Aragna ships. The Aragna ships fired their main weapons, and they barely even touched the side of the human ships. They didn't even see if the impact made the ship shudder as it continued its ascent. And once outside the pull of the gravity well, the human ship turned. The captain of the Aragna flagship shook in fear. The human battleship began to charge up a central weapon, and it fired a massive bolt of energy right through the center of the Aragna fleet. The front of the human vessel was glowing as this gigantic laser turned off. However, this did not stop the other weapons from firing as well, as it was clear to see that the fusion drives were pushing the human ship straight towards the rest of the Aragna fleet. Without skipping a beat, the Aragna charged the lines, attempting to fire all their weapons into the human vessel. However, it seemed that their projectile weapons would simply reflect off the hull and bounce off into the stratosphere, some of them bouncing and going straight down to the planet. And each of these that fired, that the shots ricocheted down towards the planet, ended up into a full volley of the humans. It seemed that they were picking off any of those that dare threaten the planet below. The Aragna, realizing that they had been completely outgunned, turned and ran, but the humans did not stop firing. They continued to fight off the Aragna until the Aragna got away from the gravity well far enough to activate its jump drives, and they blinked out. The Aragna told the Galactic at large what they had faced, and no one could believe them. It wasn't until the video was shown of the single human battleship taking out an entire Aragna battle group, save for 5%, 4.8 if you want to be specific, remaining. Those remaining, many of them retired in shame, as they did not ever want to face the human vessels again. When they realized that the sheer danger they were in, the Galactic at large decided to send a message to the humans. and they would end up ambushing one of these massive ships to show that they could simply jump in and take the ship out, as a warning to the rest of the humans to stay where they were and to not even think about threatening the Galactic at large. A single ship was chosen. It took months for the planning to be complete to figure out which ship would be by itself on a patrol far enough away that the other human ships would not be able to reach it. They settled on one, and as they blinked in, on the side of the ship it was clearly legible to read ESF Ptoa. Just as they were jumping in, the Ptoa turned its weapon systems. Most of the fleet had not even jumped fully into normal space yet, as the Ptoa began to fire its weapons towards the enemy fleet. They gave no warning, no quarter, and simply fired. It wasn't long before space itself was filled with projectiles flying back and forth. Most of the sentient species activated their energy shields, believing that they could simply deflect any of the incoming human rounds, and in a way they were correct. However, they forget Newton's third law. For whatever action, an equal opposite reaction. The force of the human rounds hitting the side of the shields, if the shields held, would simply rock the ship in the opposite direction at the same speed that the projectile came in. There was obviously changes when it came to mass, but it didn't matter enough to the crew, as many of them were crushed against their bulkheads, and most of them would die splattered against their own consoles. Many of the ships recovered would find that if they were struck on the ventral side, the spines of even the captain were crushed, as the entire body was put under immense pressure. This did not stop the assaulting force, though, as they fired their main guns into the Ptoa. The Ptoa did something that no one expected. It simply rolled as it began to fire all its weapons. And as it rolled over again and again, it was giving its weapons time to cool down as they fired again and again and again and again. And as it continued to roll and got out of visual sight of the enemy fleet, it would simply stop its weapons, allow them to cool off. If they had to be repaired or rearmed, that's when they would do it, and then they would continue to roll back around and fire again. While this was going, the enemy fleet fired as much as they could into the cells. They would realize very quickly that those were not escape pods, but instead those were simply more and more missiles and torpedoes ready to be fired. And fire they did. Many of the torpedoes the enemy fleet tried to shoot down on their way in, and they all realized far too late that this ordnance was very well armored against any type of point defense. Each of these torpedoes and missiles would crash into the ship and burrow itself deep inside before exploding, in many cases causing secondary and tertiary explosions all along the ship as it set the atmosphere on fire inside, and the ship was immediately disabled and or destroyed. The enemy fleet, when it started, numbered over 400 against 1. Before the last 20 ships pulled away, it was screamed across the radio from the last surviving commander, "What the hell does it take to kill this fucking thing?" The humans received this message as well, and simply laughed. Later on, the humans sent an envoy out to the stars to tell the rest of the universe that they would no longer be expanding beyond too much borders. They would simply choose a few other planets, a few other sectors, and that was all. It was believed that humans would not need to expand beyond this, and if they did, they would simply go and work in other territory. The community was confused as they realized that this was very, very civil for a race that built ships that were so dangerous. The Ptoa, even though it didn't get away unscathed, was able to face off so many ships and survive. The community did not understand why did humans insist on battleships Not until when they posed this question to the human ambassador. The human ambassador looked him square in the eye and said, "Better to have and not need than need and not have. Besides, considering how you folks say hello, I'm just glad we had him." Room attention! Everyone scampered to their feet as the instructor entered the room. Everyone stood at perfect attention as the instructor walked his way to the front, placed his briefcase down, and without even looking, he simply stated, "As you were." As the students all sat down, the instructor pulled out his notes for the day's class. "All right, class. Today, something a little interesting. We're going to be talking about the Battle of Ptoa. I'm sure you all know about it since it's pretty deep into our history. However, we still must go over the entire battle itself and realize where we made our mistakes and what we did right. Since all of you are going to be officers on the new breed of ships coming out, this is extremely important that you understand all this information. Before we get started, does anyone have any questions? No? Good. I didn't want to answer any right now. First, we have to talk about why we use battleships in the first place. As we all know, it is simply because we don't know what we were facing when we first reached out to the stars. We didn't know if we would reach hostile craft, we didn't know meteor showers or anything like that. Which was very interesting considering the Aragna, our first contact, thought that we were going out in force just as a show of force. This got many of the students to chuckle a little bit as they realized the Aragna, being very small compared to the human physiology, was always trying to act as though they were bigger than themselves. This was short man syndrome at its absolute finest. Alright, class. Now, we all know that the Aragna were surprised at how fast our ships were able to get off planet, and I want to know who here can answer this question. Why is it that we have so many anti-gravity motors built into our ships? Of course, many hands darted to the sky. Pointing with a knife hand out, he said, "You, over there, on the right." Without hesitation, the cadet stood up to attention and responded, "Sir, we have a lot of anti-gravity motors simply because we need to get off planet, sir." "Good, cadet, but why do we need to get off planet?" "Sir, because static defenses are the graveyards of armies, sir." "Good, cadet, sit down." Alright, now on to other parts of the ship, and though this did not play much into the battle with the Ptoa, we all understand why there's a main gun. Who here can tell me why we insist on the main gun, even though it's static and we like our turrets? Of course, another group of hands. Right here, front left. The cadet stood up. "Sir, stand off range, sir." "Good, exactly. Always remember this, cadets. Always remember that you always want to engage your target at maximum range. This is why many species look at us and don't understand why we use turrets. They almost exclusively use fixed weapons because the standoff distance, it doesn't make sense to have turrets that have to spin around fast, with the exception of point defense turrets, of course. That being said, turrets do have their uses, which is why we simply love them so much. More DACA, more better. What was that? Okay, who said that? Who said that? Out! You all better tell me who said that, or you're all going to be outside doing PT till you puke. A cadet stood up. "I said it, sir." "What did you say, cadet?" "I said more DACA, more better, sir." Okay, sit down, cadet. No more side comments from the peanut gallery. That stands for all of you, understand? "Yes, sir," they all said. Now, moving on to the actual Battle of the Ptoa. As we all understand that turrets played a massive role into this, no pun intended, as we all know, of defeating the force that came at us. This came down to the fact that our turrets could fire instantly as soon as they could lock onto a target. Why is that, cadets? This time only a few hands. "You," as he pointed straight forward, with one cadet who had his hand down. The cadet stood up. Sir, it's because we have secondary and tertiary reactors, sir. That's correct. Now, I want your eyes to stay up here. Do not look at your data device. I don't care if your girlfriend is calling. She's going to dump you if you don't pass this class anyway because you're not going to get your commission. Of course, a few of the cadets chuckled at that one. Waiting a few moments for the entire classroom to calm down, the professor continued. All right, forget the Q&A. Let's just go into the actual battle itself. As we all know, it was an ambush. One of the reasons why the ambush failed so badly is because as we look here, turning onto the monitor and showing a few of the ships that were there, these are not purpose-built ships. These were simple frigates and freighters that they were using. They strapped on a couple of weapons and thought they could do a quantity over quality. It just doesn't always work. Sometimes it does. Understand this, class. Understand that sometimes quantity is the quality that you are looking for. However, in this case, it did not work. As you know, our turrets could fire instantly. As soon as they could turn and face the enemy, they could fire, and they're always loaded. Always have one in the chamber. Never let your subordinates go without having one in the chamber unless they're doing maintenance. Understand that. They all nodded in agreement. Now, as you know, the secondary reactors were beginning to run a little hot at that point as they fired. However, one thing that did change the way the battle went very quickly, as we haven't had an actual space battle since the initial contact with the Aragna, was the fact that Newton's third law, which is, and they all said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Yeah, great. Now say that a little bit more pizzazz next time I ask. Now, understand that when they fired the turrets on the Poltava, the turrets facing them forced the entire ship to roll. It rolled over so fast that actually they had a difficult time with the gravity. And thankfully, we have learned from this. We have learned very well, as the gravity fields are actually shut off or cranked up to 3 times their normal level when you're actually in combat. Now, that is going to be up to your discretion depending on which type of ship. Normally, any type of destroyer or smaller is going to be set up where you are going to remove the gravity. However, if you're on a battleship, I do not recommend it, as you're going to get jolted every which way from Sunday, and it's not fun. Just remember, you're going to be in the simulator in 2 months. You're going to see it's not fun to be jumped around like that. Now, because of Newton's third law, it also came down to the fact that we use solid projectiles in our turrets. Very few of our turrets, until the next generation of ships comes out, are usually solid projectiles. Now, with these non-purpose built ships, they were not ready for the sudden burst to one side that being struck by us was going to happen. As it turns out, we did not realize this, and it was actually a lucky break on our part that the force was enough to launch several of these small ships to the side and quite literally turn everybody into paste. The professor clicks on another image showing the inside of the ship with many, many alien bodies, barely noticeable or recognizable in the corners, as they were simply turned into dog food and chunky salsa all around their bridge. This is what happened inside several of their ships that were struck. They were not ready for a kinetic fight. Most of their weapons are energy-based, which, as you all know, takes a few seconds to actually burn through the hull of our ships. In particular, our battleships, as we tend to have double redundant hulls. Now, a small side benefit of these turrets firing was the fact that A, it allowed us to rearm our turrets that needed them, also to cool them down so we can continuously fire, along with the fact that this spread out any damage incoming so that one side of the ship did not take all the damage and pretty much snap in half. This has now become doctrine, even though it was a happy accident of all things. However, it stands to reason, and it was surprising everyone that it was not doctrine before. That being said, that was not a total clincher of the battle, as some of their ships stayed out of range and were too small and nimble to be hit with our coil guns. That is where our missiles and torpedoes come into place. It is again imperative that you keep it in mind, the difference between the missiles and torpedoes. Tell you what, I want one of you to actually answer. What's the difference between the two? Of course, all the hands shoot up this time. You, he points to one. The cadet stands to attention. Sir, missiles are more agile but much less armored, so they cannot take a hit. However, they can strike a much more nimble target. Torpedoes are used for larger targets and tend to burrow deep into the target before detonating, causing secondary and tertiary explosions, meaning that the ship itself will most likely, if not totally destroyed, will be disabled. Due to this armor plating, it is difficult for the enemy to actually shoot them down on their way to the target. This means torpedoes, though the most expensive weapon we have, is the most effective. Sir. Very good, cadet. Take a seat. As a side note, cadets, understand that every single one of our flying ordnance, whether it be missile or torpedo, it does not matter, is now being outfitted as a good old-fashioned bunker buster for this exact reason. Originally, we thought we could just blow a hole in the side of the hull and vent the hull. Turns out it doesn't work as well as we thought. They may not be as compartmentalized, however, they are compartmentalized enough to protect the bridge. As long as the bridge and the engine compartment is still running, that ship is still dangerous. If nothing else, they can kamikaze right into our ships, and that is not something we want. Now, if you look at this section here, you'll see that the Ptoa is actually taking a hell of a lot of damage and actually being punctured several times through the hull. The enemy had not realized this, or it is most likely they would have focused on one section of the ship to try and cut her in half. However, one of the reasons why that did not work is because as soon as we realized they were in trouble, you will always remember to hear vampire, 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 and you will set all hatches and doors to condition Z. If you do not do this, just remember the old phrase, there's a million ways to die in space and they all suck. He stopped for a moment to let that soak into all the cadets listening and watching the video. Now, it should be noted that the Ptoa, even after this battle, though she killed off 380 of these vessels, again, these were not purpose-built vessels. Had we been fighting purpose-built vessels, it is estimated that the Ptoa would have only killed maybe 20% of them before going down. As it stands now, the Ptoa has been completely decommissioned as the battle had tore enough of her apart that she was almost unsalvageable. In fact, it was far cheaper to tear her apart for scrap and rebuild another ship based off her parts than it was to refit her. The mood inside the classroom tended to get a bit solemn at this point, as no one wanted to see their hero ship be sold for scrap or cut apart. It sunk into the hearts of everyone, even though the bridge section itself had been sectioned off and returned to Earth and set in a place of honor so that everyone could visit and pay their respects to those who fought alongside. The teacher continued, "Remember that our ships may be tough as all hell, but they are not invulnerable. Do not get stupid, do not get sloppy, and for the love of all that is holy, do not get cocky. The old phrase my drill sergeant once told me was, you get cocky, you get dead. And you get everyone else with you dead right next to you." Now, he wasn't a poet by any means, but you all understand. Cadets, you will be the ones commanding these ships. If they fail, that is on you. Focusing his knife hand out, he slowly moved it back and forth, making sure to get eye contact with every single cadet in that room. Now, because of the Battle of Ptoa, the politicians decided that they would make peace with the rest of the universe. At least try to. The rest of the universe seemed a little spooked at the fact that our ship was able to hold up so well. If they knew that it was almost a fluke that it survived, they wouldn't have thought that, and we would probably be hip deep in a war still. However, as it stands now, the new generation of ships is simply going to be used as defense. And as stated before, we want mobile defense. Static defense is a bad idea. Anything beyond satellites or the new anti-ship weapons that mostly are based on Terra itself, it is ridiculous to even consider static defenses. They could just stay at standoff distance and just launch ordnance and ordnance until you simply run out of defensive measures, and then you're, well, fucked. That being said, you are the ones who are going to be responsible for protecting human territory. We can't move a planet. We can't take it out of orbit. We can't hide it. It's just there. So if for some reason we get invaded again, or somebody gets froggy and decides to jump, then you are the ones who have to come running. Thankfully, with the new ships, the Bismarck class that's being made are not battleships anymore. They're total dreadnoughts. They have a new class of weapon, a new class of engine. Most of these engines are actually based off the design of captured ships from the Battle of Pultowa. Also, you will be having more and more energy-based turrets as well. This is a very interesting turn of events. I was actually surprised I lived to see it. Now, one can hope that you go your entire careers without ever having to fire a shot, and you can end your career with total victory, as you have not had to engage in a war, you have not had to take anyone out, and you have not had to lose anyone either. That being said, if there is any alien who ever tries to go beyond simple trade of raw goods with humanity, be ready to bring all your weapons to bear. However, as the old army used to say, you will never fight alone. We will always have more, and we will stand side by side with each other, and we will face down the enemies at the gate. I only bring this up because there are certain rumblings around. I decided not to leave any of you out of the loop. However, you must keep this within yourselves. We do not know what's going on with the Galactic community, as they do not talk to us much. A few envoys every once in a while. And of course, trade of raw materials. But in truth, we don't need much beyond what our sectors hold. It is imperative that we hold our own territories. If we no longer become self-sufficient, well, this is not that type of history class. However, I will say that when food gets tight, people will do anything to feed their families. I'd rather these guns be pointed out than in, especially since it seems as though the Galactic as a whole has not learned the hard lessons that we humans have had to learn through blood, using our own battleships of old who used to be stuck only on the blue oceans as they fired on each other, sometimes at point blank range and sometimes from 25 miles away. But we learned these lessons that expansionist nations are extremely dangerous. And many of the alien species, though they follow their own galactic law, as they will not touch an expanding species, as in starting out new species like ours was, until we reach beyond our sector, they will more than happy to go and take over your territory as soon as you reach that level. This is why you will be out on the front lines, watching over everyone, and that is why the Pultowa up there, that is why that ship fought so hard, not just for survival, but they knew that if that battle group had gotten through, they would have rained all sorts of hell on the nearest planet before any other ship got there to actually fight them away. This is why, like the captain of the Pultowa said, you need to know your ship, stem to stern, ventral dorsal, every bulkhead down to every bolt. You need to know what it's capable of and how to use it to its absolute best abilities. Then and only then do you survive. Remember that, and I'll see you in the next class. As he got up to leave and got to the door. Room attention! As you were. The first and probably only rule of any warfare is never, ever underestimate your opponent. No matter what happens, you plan for everything because you never want to underestimate them. Which is why you hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. And it's a damn good thing we did, because after over 10 years, those damn critters came back again. Can't they just leave us alone? We hadn't even expanded the Terran hegemony anywhere since the whole Poltova incident. We just left it where it was. We were done. We were self-sufficient. We were good. Our population wasn't growing all by leaps and bounds or anything, so it was going to take a hell of a lot of time before we reached out. Almost none of these frickin' Xenos showed up ever, except to once in a while say hi just to see how we're going. Couldn't they just leave us the hell alone? But no, that's too much to ask now, isn't it? Ugh. I still remember that day. You would think it was yesterday. Oh, wait, it was yesterday when those idiots jumped into our territory. They jumped in without a word, and as we started to send communications, the only thing we got back was surrender or die. Yeah, that's a smart thing to say to Terran military. Surrender or die. You guys are idiots. Well, we thought they would aim at like Proxima 3 or something like that. Oh no, they actually jumped into the Sol sector. Granted, they were Neptune orbit, although Neptune was on the other side of the sector at that point. Didn't matter. They came in and they made a beeline for Earth. What they forgot was that Mars was in the way, so they would be held back a little bit on that. But holy hell. I know they learned from their experience. It was pretty obvious to see. But didn't it occur to them in the slightest that we might have, upgunned a little bit, since last time was just one ship with just random civilian vessels that had some guns on them and got stomped, quite literally got stomped out of the sector. But here we are now, watching the replay of everything that happened. And what happened? Oichi mama. It makes me just want to go, do they have brains up the back end of their carapace? Their fourth point of contact or something? Because that's the only thing I could think of for a good reason. They came in all weapons ready. And as soon as they jumped in, they began to launch fighter craft, which I find hilarious. Who the hell fights fighters in space outside of an asteroid field? Seriously, what in the ever-loving crap? Terrain dictates. Do they realize there's no terrain between Mars and them? It didn't take but 5 minutes before every single ship was on alert. Everyone was gearing up and everyone was getting ready. Though it would take a little bit longer for them to go sub-FTL all the way to Mars, Earth, and Venus, it was still going to be a tense couple of hours until then. We figured they would start firing any type of long-range torpedoes towards us. We were just working on experimental stuff at that point, and they thought, they just have their point defense cannons and those big guns. They have to be fairly close as far as space is concerned. No. You idiots. It was almost comical. As our first few battle groups started to join together, some coming from Mars, some coming from Earth, others coming from outside the sector, and just began to pull everything together. We're watching all this happen, and the Xenos are just continuing to advance. Maybe they thought they had a trick up their sleeve. I don't know, and I don't care. But seriously, our new turrets are energy-based. They're not projectile-based anymore. At least, not all of them. The main turrets, especially on the front of the ships, are set up as just massive particle beam cannons. What the hell were they thinking? I still remember watching, just watching the blips as the news looked over to see how far the enemy fleet was. They zoomed out so we could get a good idea, and we were getting live video and live sensor data from the front lines. They were that close. And just as our battle groups linked together to one main fleet, I still remember the Venusian fleet was going to take a minute to get there, but they simply said, "Go ahead and start the killing without us. We'll catch up." No, they didn't. As soon as they got everyone in formation, they got in standard spindle formation with our dreadnoughts midsection spaced out around the entire web. For those that don't understand, a spindle is a web. If you've seen a web, you know what I'm talking about. So they could maximize their weapons fire. They simply lined up well beyond visual range and launched beams across. But the kicker is these beams don't exactly pierce, they cut. So for several minutes, we just watched these beams slowly move and drape across the battlefield, covering such vast distances that you could actually see the beam bending as though it's a whip or a piece of grain waving in the wind as it's moving back and forth. And on the other end of these beams, atmospheres were being ignited. The ships themselves, the beams would cut into the hull just enough to light their atmosphere inside, and kaboom, there you go. Try breathing without an atmosphere, you dumbasses. You would think they would learn by now to at least decompressurize their units, but no. I swear, are we the only ones that were not the highest species on the planet when started out? How can these guys be so arrogant? Now, granted, they did try to fire their torpedoes, but they were completely outranged by ours. Ours were halfway there before they even fired their first round of torpedoes. And it was absolutely insane. We couldn't figure out what was going on with the enemy forces as our torpedoes just whipped past theirs, knocking a couple of them out. Surprisingly, they didn't detonate except for one, as it was an absolute perfect direct hit, and just whipped past each other. And before their ordnance even found their mark, we could just see more dots disappear, and on the video, more flashes in the ether. It was absolutely insane as we realized that more and more of their ships were falling apart, but they still advanced. As we realized that their battle group, their fleet was so large, it dwarfed ours easily 12-1. And we had only taken out maybe 20% at this point. And I stress the maybe part. But then we got the most interesting surprise from inside our own ships as they began to lock all their bulkheads in anticipation for the first volley of strikes. They got everything ready, and we could see video from inside one of our flagships as everyone brace, 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 and everything just bounced off the hull. What? Then suddenly we realized that was the initial dummy munitions. The torpedoes hadn't hit yet. And when they did, they didn't penetrate. They did explode, forcing many of our own ships out of formation, at least for a while, as they continued to move and their thrusters began blasting through the sky, trying to stabilize as best as they could. Many of our casualties came from simply being knocked out of their seats when they weren't ready. But even before that, they had already fired a second volley. This volley was tracking, and the fleets, even though they couldn't see each other, and it did take a minute or two before the ordnance actually reached, were simply flinging rocks at each other throughout space. And the waiting was the worst part, as you didn't know what was aimed at you. It could have been aimed at a ship behind you, beside you, you weren't sure, but your warning alarms were going off. I worried as many of my students were up there. Yet as the torpedoes started to pass a certain point, some sort of Lagrange point. Now, this is odd because it's a new thing with the new battleships, and I have not been briefed on it. It has something to do with you're in that formation, and that much mass causes some sort of distortion. But once the Ordnance passed that point, there wasn't any stopping it. And right behind them, they waited and they waited until the perfect point to fire all their projectile main cannons as they whipped feverishly across the ether towards the enemy fleet. The enemy fleet probably didn't even know what was going on, as right behind the ballistics, another round of torpedoes was fired. And they waited. And they waited to see what else would happen. Maybe they would get scared off by this amount of damage. Who knows? Maybe they would do like the guy on TV. That's a lot of damage. But the waiting. They had to wait, as it seemed like the enemy fleet was having trouble setting the volleys of their torpedoes as they were coming at 1, 2, 3, 4 at a time. This would not overwhelm the point defense systems, and they could easily be dispatched. And they had to wait, though. They had to wait for the Ordnance to get close and wait until the cannons had cooled off. As we all know, heat in space is a real bitch because it doesn't dissipate, and the cooling systems can only do so much. I remember, just for shits and giggles, I looked around to see if I could get an exterior view of one of the ships, and sure enough, the turret guns were still glowing hot. If they fired them again, they'd probably overload and explode. So it wasn't worth it. Yet off went another round of ballistics, and off went another round of torpedoes. I was wondering how many of those damn ships, how many torpedoes do they have? The Poltova didn't even have this many to shoot out. Oh, that's right, these are the new dreadnoughts, so they should be all sorts of fun to the party. And with that, the destroyers that were flanking them, the missile frigates that were all over the place, that just constantly launching everything. A torpedo frigate was even seen out there. I didn't even know those were commissioned yet. But it was just one right after the other as it went flying off. 18 tubes firing at once out of one ship. That's crazy. That's more than enough to take out one of their battleships. And across the ether, we again see more and more of their ships bursting. Several of the dots seemed to fall out of formation, and they finally got close enough where we could get real time to see their ships. We could get a 3D image, and I looked, and sure enough, more than half of their fleet was adrift. Were they serious? It was this bad? At this point, you would think they would withdraw, but no, these stubborn sons of bitches decided they wanted to go whole hog, and they went straight towards our guys. And this time, they were not waiting for anybody. It seemed like at first they were trying to keep the fleet together, but no, this time they went full burn, or whatever they use in their engines to accumulate burn, and they came straight at our soldiers and our ships. Well, guess what? You still got a hell of a lot of space to cover, and we got a whole lot more guns to shoot. Because if there's one thing our Space Force love, they love them guns, and they continued to fire. The battle itself only lasted a few more hours. But that battle only went until the cannons cooled off enough that they could once again strafe across the universe and just zigzag those lasers across, ripping wholesale ships in half. Some of them quite literally sliced clean, as these particle beams do not explode, they slice. It was absolute carnage. And many people were laughing, because as you know, you can't have slaughter without laughter. Then we heard something that scared the crap out of us. Another fleet was coming in. It was from the same species. What the hell? Was that first one a diversion? It must have been, because the only ones even close were the Venusians. This fleet would be close enough that they would be within firing solution of Venus itself in about 3 hours. Unless they just fired dumb munitions, which that is exactly what they did. The Venetian fleet spun around, and one of their ships burned as fast as it could and fired one missile. Now, I couldn't tell if it was a missile or torpedo, but I've never seen any of our ordnance move that fast ever. This looked like an ordnance I had heard about, but I wasn't sure until it detonated. And as it detonated, it spread a mist across the entire battle group. And as it touched each group, the ships themselves seemed to fall apart, as though they were made of ash, and a breeze came up. They began to rip themselves to pieces as small bits opened up more and more. Their weapons began to fall apart. And as their ordnance began to start being ripped apart by the nanomachines that were now eating down through their engine compartment, they would explode. This would, of course, end the rest of his ship. And that was the end of the battle. 2 enemy battle groups dropped, and we didn't lose a single ship. It was interesting. Just before I started this, just as a reminder to myself to what happened, to remind myself this actually just happened, what we found in the alien transmissions as they sent more messages back to their home system, and they simply asked, "What the hell does it take to kill these things?" As the instructor walks to class, he double checks his watch to make sure he's not too early, as it is normal for the instructor to be approximately 5 to 10 minutes early, yet the students are expected to be 10 minutes early so that they can prep any devices they're going to use to record or find a good seat, converse with their friends, make sure their notes are right, and all the other doodads that need to be done prior to each and every class. Being that this is a military academy, they all seem to walk briskly with their shoulders back and their heads up. Many of those who saw the instructor walking towards the class suddenly picked up their pace, and many went into a full sprint, whipping right past the instructor. The instructor, of course, realized which students these were and smiled a little bit, chuckling internally, realizing, hey, I did the same crap when I was a kid, so I can't hold it against them too much. As the instructor stopped at the doorway and waited outside, he could hear everyone whispering to them, "The instructor's here, the instructor's here. Hey, get ready, get your shit ready." He again chuckled a little bit as he realized there was a few getting ready to call the room to attention when he walked in. As he looked at his watch again, he realized that he had approximately 2 minutes. This is where he waited. He counted down and would enter the room approximately 1 minute before class began. This would give him, and if anybody he was with, enough time to go into class, set up what they needed to, as they had already had the lesson plan already scheduled and set up. But we would make sure that they had everything lined up so the class went well. As he double-checked his watch again, the analog watch again clicked up 1 minute prior. He turned to walk in, and just as the entire class jumped up, he heard one of them about to call the room to attention, just yelled, "As you were! Sit down, we got a lot to cover." The instructor saw everybody starting to get back down into their seats and simply opened up his briefcase as he put it onto the table. Pulling out the few notes that he had on the subject, he also started to go through his computer. This one was linked up to all the arrays, the 3D graphics, and also any type of projection picture that might come up was already preloaded. Quickly finishing up everything he needed to do, the instructor simply looked at the clock and said, "All right, class, shut the doors. We got a lot to cover today, and we're going to get right to it." Clicking on an image, he looks through, and everyone knows this photo. This is a very interesting photo from one of the deep space satellites that just happened to be close enough to catch a broadside picture of the Battle of Sol. "You all know about this one," he states. "This is the Battle of the Sol Sector, okay? A battle for our soul is what you guys like to call it, and I always knew that was going to show up because that's something that came from before my generation. Now, since generations are kind of a moot point nowadays, since we have the technology that we have, well, let's just say it's before your time. All that being said, I wanted to get into immediately the different types of tactics and logistics of this battle. Now, most of you are fully aware of the timeline of what happened. However, I still need to go over for those who are not completely understanding of how everything went down and in what order. The first things first, changing the image to a 3D image. One of our deep space probes was able to catch the FTL as it was just starting to reach outside the sector. As of right now, we can barely catch FTL a few minutes before it enters the sector. That being said, we do not have the technology yet to stop them from entering the sector. That is being developed. Oh wait, you're not supposed to hear that. Hint, hint. Several of the students looked up and suddenly grinned a little bit. It was very common for this instructor to give some sort of hint of what technology may be coming down the pipe, as these were going to be future sailors inside the Terran Navy. Or they're going to be piloting their own ships, and they need to know what's out there so they can work with it, not against it. As humans were definitely on the chopping block after all the issues that had happened already, well, if they didn't want species-wide annihilation, they better listen up. The instructor continued. As you know, we all caught them coming in, and it was a very large mass of group, a very large group of vessels coming in. We do not take this sort of thing lightly, ever. We made that mistake one time and one time only, and that was well before I started breathing. As you all know, in World War II, they dismissed the large group of fighters and thought it was something completely different, or they thought their radar was malfunctioning or what have you. Even though our new deep space sensors are more accustomed to experimental technology, we were not dismissing anything. And a good thing too. That put everyone on alert, and thankfully so, because as soon as the enemy fleets came in, well, game on. And of course everyone chimed in, yeah, game on. I'm glad you all know that reference. The instructor tried to make light of a serious subject, as that would help keep everyone's attention. Alright, now you can see the disposition of the enemy fleet. They weren't stupid. They had everything set up. Most of their main guns were spread out evenly across the entire formation. Now, they didn't quite set up in spindle formation as we do. However, it was more of a cul-de-sac formation, which we're still trying to figure out why this was. However, it does make a little bit of sense, as the edges of the cul-de-sac are what actually had their big guns. They were spacing them out as best they could. We surmised that they were trying to do this so that if they had to give a full-on frontal volley, they would be able to fire all their main guns in a wide path so that eventually their rounds, wherever they hit, would hit something. Now, I know a lot of you are playing many of the video games that everything is guided. No matter, every time you shoot, the rounds will automatically turn and hit their target, even if they're dummy rounds. This is not the case. When you're talking about distances this long, a lot of things change. The reason why we set up in our formation is to maximize our firepower for the same exact reason. If you look at the way that they're lining up, if they fired, it's very difficult to find a gap in between every single one of these ships that our ships would be able to dodge, so their rounds would hit something. You need to remember that even energy weapons, even our lasers, which we will get into in a few minutes, even our turrets take time to cross distances that far. Even though it's several seconds, it's enough for somebody to move out of the way if they want to. So keep that in mind, everybody, while you're doing this. Distance means everything in space. Since terrain does not dictate unless you're outside in the Oort cloud or the asteroid belt or something like that, and they definitely were not. We were actually beyond the asteroid belt at this point, most of them, but we'll get into that again later. That is what made all this formation I shouldn't say nonsense. The formation make a little bit more sense. Understand that everything, it doesn't matter what, at that distance, you have time to move. Now, because of that, I want you all to realize that you need to back your brains up in time. Back your brains up so that back during the Civil War and Revolutionary Wars of the Americas, I want you to think about everyone lining up and firing into each other in volleys. It's the same thing because the weapons were not as accurate. Though one group was far more accurate than the other, it didn't matter. Using a smoothbore musket meant that you're gonna miss. A lot of times you are gonna miss. Now, granted, certain doctrines made it so that the ones who wore red missed a hell of a lot more than the ones who wore blue, but that's a whole nother class. This is not a history class. This is a tactics class. So understand that and understand it well. Now, we're going to move on to as they advanced. All right, you can see, as I speed up time here, the image changes to the 3D image of the fleets beginning to join forces. Several of the human fleets were able to join up fairly quickly. Now, you can't do an FTL jump right through the asteroid field unless you want to go many levels of splat. Okay, it's just not a good idea. That being said, once they got through the asteroid field, it was pretty much smooth sailing, no pun intended. As you can see by this here, the Venetian fleet was way out of place. They could not join the main group with Earth and Mars. However, the Earth and Martian fleet was more than capable of taking care of everything. Now, they did get, as you can see in this graph here, they did get several more ships from like Io and things of that nature. However, since they're simply satellites, they do not have the ability to create large ships like we did. However, them still bringing in their own ships was still a bonus. It is always better to have more ships in a straight up slugfest like this. The instructor once again changed the image. As you can see, once they lined up, it was more in spindle formation, lining everything up so that we could maximize the area of space that we could hit. At that point, everyone locked in with each other. All the AIs and gunners started locking into each other so that they could do their little dance, their little serenade, their little conductor swing that they were going to do with all their turrets. Now, it is of note that ever since the Battle of Pultowa, we have known that ballistic turrets are more than enough to flip over even our largest colony ships. We have switched over to energy weapons. Now, there's a major issue with the energy weapons, which we will address soon. As you can see, and I'm sure you've all seen it by now, that at this point, it looks like energy whips going through as they begin to fire their turrets towards the enemy fleet. The reason they were using energy weapons first is because we have been able to condense our particle beams to the point where they do not disperse anywhere near as fast as a standard laser. Now, for those of you who are looking into engineering, this is going to be easy for you to understand. Those of you who are not, simply understand that without being able to contain the beam itself, it will simply disperse very, very quickly. Think of your flashlight. How fast does that thing widen out to the sides and the light just kind of dissipate into nothing unless you're able to condense it somehow. Keep this in mind. You need to know your ship, as stated before, stem to stern, port to ventral, bulkhead to bolt. You need to know it all. If you do not understand it, you cannot use it. Understand?
Yes, sir,
they all said. Good. Now, as you can see, as the energy waves were sent across, and I'm simply going to call them waves because as you can see, the distance, because they were moving the turrets, makes the energy from each of these cannons look like it's a whip. It's not actually a whip. As they dragged them across, each of these turrets, when it fired, would strike across and cut into the enemy fleet. Now, it is of note that these particle beams are extremely hot. And that is why, as you can see, he moved over and got another image, a close 3D image of one of the enemy cruisers. Once it struck this ship, it did cause catastrophic damage even from a grazing hit. Fast forwarding the image, the beam was brought across just down on its starboard ventral side, just barely swiping the side of the ship as it moved away from the beam itself. However, it is seen in the image that the compartments explode at this point. As you can see, the ship itself blew. Part of it just exploded. Now, who here can tell me why? Hands shoot up across the stage. You in the back, over right there. The instructor pointing his hand straight at the student. The student stood up. Sir, it's because it lit the atmosphere on fire. Sir. Absolutely, cadet. That is 100% right. You can sit down. You need to understand that these things are so hot that they will quite literally cause every oxygen molecule to bond with something and combust. If there's any hydrogen, kablooey. Okay? And these guys happen to use a type of methane to breathe with. Now, it's a very light methane, but it is still mixed with a whole bunch of hydrogen. Which is why, when we do get this picture, changing the image, you can see that the atmosphere blowing out of here is not the standard yellow and orange that we're used to. It is different colors of green and blue, along with the standard colors we're used to. Reason being is that, congratulations, you just lit a fart on fire. Letting the laughter kind of joke around. You need to understand that every single species has a different way of breathing, a different way of operating, a different way of living. You need to understand that, so with each different type of species, you know how to deal with them most effectively. And for those of you to understand, dealing with this effectively means you need to know how to kill them very, very quickly. It doesn't have to be gruesome, it just has to be quick. Put them down, done, over. Move on to the next one. Now, as you can see in the video, as he fast forwards it, each of these turrets sends a beam across which swipes across the sky. Each turret is still with its standard 3 barrels. The kicker is, what the aliens didn't know, is we can fire them once every 5 to 20 minutes, depending on how much the power output was. And the fact that the power output on these was cranked up to 100%, well, left to this issue right here, and most everyone has seen this. This is not a doctored photo. I want you to all understand this. The image shows several turrets actually glowing red and white hot. They're glowing so hot against the side of the ship that it looks like they're about to explode. The cadets look on in awe as they realize this actually is what happened. Understand this, once we fired our full volley, we had to let the cannons cool. This is not something that has to happen at 50% power or lower. So if they were within, say, one planet's orbit, we would be able to just continually fire at them. But they wouldn't be able to dodge them anyway, and we wouldn't have to leave streaks across. Again, distance is what? Key, sir! Everyone screams out. Good. Now, if you look at this, after we ran out of energy weapons, we realized that they were close enough for their own ordnance to fire. Our guys did not wait. As they fired their final volley, they allowed their first round of torpedoes to go out. These torpedoes were set to be dumb munitions initially. They were meant specifically to hit the front line, take up a lot of their point defense system fire, and find out exactly what the hell we're facing. You need to understand this. This is why decoys are used so often in modern warfare. Everybody uses decoys. We looked and we actually tore their ships apart. They were loaded with decoys. In fact, some of the things we were shooting at, if you look at this image here, one moment. Yes, you'll see here, next to one of these destroyers and on its buddy frigate, you will see decoys in between. Each of these we were actually picking up as additional ships. Now, each of them has their own atmosphere inside, but they were given off a signature relatively the same as one of their destroyers, which made us think they were a whole lot more dangerous than they were. It is truly believed that they were trying to goat us into getting close, as we found out that they did not fire their ordnance, their first round that is, until ours was at least 50% on its way. Now, this took about 5 to 10 minutes for it to actually reach. And that's because of what, class? Distance, sir. Exactly. Understand that the distances cause these battles to go on for a long, long time. And it is Ever since the age of sail went away and we started using turrets on Ironsides and things like that, as you know, the first time Ironsides met, there was no victor. And the battle just kept going and going and going until they either ran out of ammo or they had to leave because the tide was going out. He changes his image again. Now, when the first set of torpedoes actually did strike, we didn't get as much as we thought initially. These reports came in after, and if you'll see the image here, if you take this image and overlay it with this one, setting an image right next to it, you can see that about 25 to 45% of what we struck was actually the decoys, which was the initial round of explosions, really. We started hitting their engines, and their engines caught their own atmosphere on fire. The more dummy munitions, even though they're harder to strike down, still have a little bit of explosive in them, just for basically good measure. However, this was the reason why they were able to keep fighting so much, and we were able to send out our next round of torpedoes and ballistics this time. Now, for everyone to understand, ballistics are not going away anytime soon. If your energy weapons fail, you still need a direct fire weapon system. You always need a backup, and you need a backup to your backup, which is why we have mid and short range ballistic weapons on every single one of our ships. Even on our cargo haulers, you'll get medium and short range weapons. Why? Well, they tried piracy, a few folks, back in the day, and it didn't go over quite well. Why? We have medium and short range weapons on our ships. We're going to shoot you. Okay, I don't want to get off topic. So you can look up the pirates in another class. That's another history class. However, I want you to understand that when the first group of torpedoes came in, we all thought we're going to be taking huge losses. And to our absolute shock and dismay, well, I shouldn't say ours, but more theirs, our point defense system laid into them quite well. It's surprising how many actually detonated right before striking the hull of a ship. Now, do we get away unscathed? Absolutely not. A few of the ships did get damaged. A few had to pull off the line for repairs. One of our torpedo frigates, which is a new design, was almost struck, and he actually, it's still funny to hear the radio transmission between the two. I don't have the audio, but I will say it's hilarious when a communications officer says, "Thank you, I think I just shit myself." Yeah, I would too if I was sitting on that much ordnance and there was something coming at me. That being said, there was another issue. Our battleships. I don't know why they didn't think we would upgrade our battleships. The Poltava was shot to hell, so much so that it was decommissioned and only one small piece of it still remains. All of our other battleships are so heavily armored that most of what they sent couldn't breach the hull even though it struck, and you can see in this video, yep, right here. The cadets are shown an image of one of the battleships trying desperately to shoot several torpedoes as they get in very close. They get all but one. One strikes the side of the hull. There's a burst and the ship lurches hard to one side. But it's still there. There's not even atmosphere breaching out the hull. Now, as you all know from your engineering class, this is the double redundancy hull design. As you can see as I zoom in close, yep, there it is. That honeycomb structure is a nanite composite. It's a basically self-healing system. So unless they get through the outer hull, that, and the inner hull, they're not breaching shit. The enemy did not realize that we were already starting to work on this technology when the Battle of the Poltava actually happened. Now, we're going to move on to the next sector of the battle itself. 1 second. Oh, where's that video? I had it. I swear to you, students, I had it. And oh, yep, here it is. All right. Here is the volley of torpedoes and then ballistics. As you can see, there's a noticeable delay between the firing of the torpedoes and the ballistics. As you know, the ballistics will travel much faster. Most of them are being fired from either rail guns or coil guns. Difference being, well, simple movement of electrons. I'm not going to get into it. Again, this is not an engineering class. This is a tactics class. Now, as you can see, the delay did not actually stop the ballistics from striking first. They actually overtook the torpedoes, and unfortunately, we do not have any video of from the torpedoes as the ballistics went by. But the fact that it's in the middle of the darkness of space, you probably wouldn't have seen much anyway. As we look here on the radar, we can see that the ballistics actually came in. The enemy was actually so busy trying to fire off the ballistic shots, which they barely did. And apparently they forgot that inertia is a thing, because as you can see in, hold on, I'll keep this video here instead of this one here. Here's one of their frigates. They're able to deflect one of our ballistic shells, but it's still going, it's still tumbling, and instead of piercing the ship, you can see it hits it broadside, and crossbody blocks the whole thing and cuts the whole thing in half. And yeah, I'm sure that was not a welcome sight for any of the enemy forces. Were they able to stop some of our ballistics? Yes. However, they were so busy trying to stop them, they did not stop our next round of torpedoes. And that one was absolutely devastating. And by the time they even started to realize how bad they were getting screwed, there was another volley on the way. Now, it is of note that the enemy did not stop firing. Okay, they just kept going. They were completely, as it used to be called, ride or die. They were ready to just do anything they could just to take out a few of us. Now, it is understandable that the galactic population far exceeds ours. Our population is barely at this point around 9 billion. And that's over all the different planets and satellites, not to mention all the ships and everywhere else. We are, as far as the galactic community is concerned, we are a tiny little village with barely anyone in it. So they are able to simply throw bodies at a problem until the problem goes away. We do not have that option, which is why they kept firing more and more and more. And as soon as we realized that their fleet was dropping in the tens of percentiles every single time a volley of our ordnance hit, the Venusian fleet was actually called off. It was something else, and you all have the audio, I'm sure you have, of the Venetian admiral getting pissed off saying, "Oh, you didn't leave anybody for us." Well, it is also of note that they actually killed more per ship than any of the rest of the fleet. Because as the main fleets of Earth and Mars were busy taking down this group, another one thought they'd be sneaky. And here they are. Here's a 3D image from the radar right here. As you can see, it is almost as large as that first one. And at that point, the Venetian fleet realized that they were severely outnumbered, like beyond anything they were ready for. And the rest of the fleet was way out of place. It would take them way too long. The Venetian fleet would have turned into the first wave of alien forces. They would have simply been decimated by the just insane numbers of ordnance coming at them. Even our ships can only handle so much. And understand that. Our ships are still ships. They can still be sunk, in a sense. You don't actually sink in space. If you're sinking, you're in deep thought. A few people stopped to think about what he just said. Yeah, I know it's a dad joke. I'm trying to keep you occupied. Now, I will say that out of desperation, the Venusian admiral used a technology we weren't sure was going to work. This was a fluke. We had been testing nanite bombs for a long time, and more often than not, they're like a vacuum. They just suck. They would usually only take out maybe 3 or 4 ships, eaten through the hull of maybe a dozen in a group this size, and that was it. They would simply shut off. They're under a timer, actually. After a certain amount of time, they simply self-delete their programming. And without the programming, they just stop, period. They don't make more themselves. As you can see, they got within range. They did fire their one ordnance with this. It is of extreme note that this ordnance was very, very, very large, which is why they only have one of them. It takes an actual battleship to deploy this piece of equipment. Just like back in the day, we had a air burst bomb that had to be delivered by a cargo plane just because it was so big. It would not fit on an actual attack aircraft. So that is why they only had one. Not only experimental, but most ships cannot carry this thing. It is just too massive. Why is it massive? You need that much to spread the nanites out. You need to shove them out into space at a speed absolutely insane, and you have to have so many of them to actually make a dent, because one nanite, after about maybe an hour of working, might, and I stress might, cut a hole in the hull about the size of your pinky nail, which is something that any crew can easily handle. It is also noted that this ordnance was something that most people don't like handling. For those of you who don't understand nanite technology, especially nanite weapons, you need to pay more attention in your medical classes, as nanite technology is one of the key proponents in our current medical technology. It's the reason why I am a hell of a lot older than I look, I'll tell you that much. Now, when it was deployed, you can see on the video, it was launched as fast as possible. It actually had a 3-stage rocket to try and get it to its area of deployment as fast as possible. And honestly, I think the enemy didn't know what was going on. I think they thought it was a propaganda thing. A ship or some missile going out. Now, they did move. We will give them this. They did move a few ships to make sure this piece of ordnance simply flew between them. See, there's no guidance rockets on this thing. Not yet. I'm not saying they're working on it, but there's no guidance engines, no boosters on any side. This thing flies straight and true, and that's it. And it goes for a certain amount of time and then goes off. That's all. There's no fancy schmancy anything to this. Now, as the ordnance got close to the enemy fleet, you can see in the video how they got out of the way. They didn't even get able to fire at it, as just as it got within point defense weapons range, you can see it deploying. The image itself shows the rocket blowing off its nose cone and the sides opening up and flailing out as though the scales on a snake were being pushed the opposite direction and exposing the skin. And then you could see small bursts from everywhere, from the front of the ordnance all the way to the back, in sequence, all the way to the back. These bursts are what sent the nanites out in a small cloud. So small that most sensors couldn't pick up the nanites themselves. They picked up the explosion. And as those bursts went out, the ordnance that it came in simply went adrift. The enemy was probably looking at them crazy. Now, if you look close, you can see that some of the enemy ships were actually trying to back away, but it was far too late. That burst you saw sent the nanites out at about 3/4 the speed of sound. When ships are as close as they are, within a couple of kilometers, you have only a few seconds before the nanites start to end up on top of you. And since the ordnance was very close to the center of their formation, it did catch most of their frigates and destroyers. It didn't get many of their battleships, unfortunately, but because frigates and destroyers usually don't have a thicker hull, it chewed right through them very quickly. And if you don't have a strong stomach, I strongly suggest that you turn away for the next part of this image. He continued the video as it showed that the ships were being eaten away, as though the ships themselves were going through hundreds of thousands of years of poor maintenance, as the hulls seemed to rust away, chip away into small pieces, the small pieces disintegrating as they went away, and then large, huge gaps started opening up in the hull. They ate all the way through to the crew compartments, and then crew members started being vented out into space, many of them still flailing around, flapping whatever appendages they might have, be they 2 arms, 4, or a tail maybe. Each of them looked absolutely petrified as they started to run out of oxygen. If they were lucky, the sudden loss of oxygen would suck all the air out of their lungs, or whatever they call lungs in their species, and they would immediately pass out. They wouldn't wake up. It was at that point the fleet must have realized something was wrong, as they sent a few in to try and find out what was going on, and they too got caught in the nanite swarm. The nanites would continue to spread out across the formation. Even if a small handful touched the ship, there was no shutting them off. They just ate through the ship themselves, finding themselves pushed closer and closer to the engine compartments. For those that are watching, you need to understand that the nanite swarm themselves is designed specifically to seek out any type of energy, which is why if you watch on the video, you can see that they're going straight towards their weapons and they're going straight towards the engines, mostly towards the engines. But when they go towards the weapons, you can see, and on the video, one of the ships simply explodes, shortly followed by 2 or 3 more. Yeah, that happens. Critical mass is a thing. You need to understand that these nanites are extremely dangerous, and most everybody at this point is thinking about legislation to extremely limit nanite swarms of any type. They are beyond dangerous and difficult to control. The only option you have if you have a nanite swarm is an EMP blast, and a very strong one at that. You're not talking about, well, let me put it in a phrase you'll understand. If we had a nanite outbreak in this room, they would hit this area with an EMP so strong that almost everybody in this room would be fried, because your brain and your heart are an electrical system. It would just be done. It would overload. They would need to hit it that strong to make sure they got every single nanite, which is what we did after the battle, by the way, but we will be getting into that in a couple of minutes. As you can see, the Venetian fleet didn't actually take any true casualties, except for those jumping up and down and might have slipped. They did take out many, 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 many more ships than anybody else. Though they don't look at that with a sense of pride, a win's a win. Winning is winning, period. Okay? Because, as we all know, in our line of work, there is no second place. Second place is a body bag. Understand that, and understand that very, very well. So we will take them down with any means necessary. Now, after the battle, as you know, not a single one of the enemy ships was able to retreat, as we had already sent enough ordnance from the first fleet to take out all the engines. They did not have the ability to jump. The second fleet that was going to be sneaky, well, there's no fleet left. And once it was over, we did send a control ship in there. This ship was completely unmanned, and yes, we do have the video. Here it is. They are seeing a 3D image of a small frigate. It is covered, just covered on all sides by different antennae. Different styles as well. This is what we call the EMP ship. Once you use it, it's a one-off, because it will quite literally cook itself, and you'll see here in the video. Let me fast forward. Okay, to right about here. This is when it started reaching the nanite swarm. We did have cameras close enough where we could see what was going on, and you can see as soon as the nanites touched it, they started to eat it. Many of those antennas were immediately put out of action within just a few seconds. But they weren't expecting what's coming next. He hits play, and you see a burst of energy. An actual ball of energy comes out of it. the ball actually can be seen with a shockwave going in an omnidirectional fashion all the way out. It seemed to almost warp time and warp space in a way. But as it did, around everywhere in the direction of the swarm, you could see tiny, 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 tiny little specks just popping. Those were the nanites exploding. That's what happens with nanites. When you hit them with an EMP, they fry and they blow up. They don't have any, there's no way of protecting them from this. And this is our number one weapon against the nanite storm. Now, we do have other ones, smaller EMP cannons. They are now currently being installed on every single ship just in case the enemy did actually see that we did this. We don't need them coming at us with any type of nanites. And also, you know, better to have and not need than need and not have, sir. Good, you all remembered that one. Along with that was the cleanup with the first fleet. We did send at least 3 more EMP ships in to make sure we got all the nanites. Again, they are extremely dangerous and we are not playing games with those things at all. Do not trifle with them ever. Ever. I don't care if you end up being an ordnance tech. Now on to the original first fleet that jumped into Sol. We were able to salvage a lot of the computers. Our eggheads, those 30-pound brain guys, are unbelievably good at this sort of thing. I mean, it's what they do. They've done this for, decades. They are so good at this, it's crazy. I cannot stress how important it is also to get as much intel as possible. Because the old phrase is, information is ammunition, sir. Good, you remembered that one too. And you always want the secret of life, which is more ammo, sir. Exactly. Now, on to what we found inside. We found out that this was almost exclusively a single species that came at us. They got froggy, decided to jump. They didn't realize that we as humans are extremely territorial and have no interest in watching our loved ones being put in chains or our planets being glassed. So, yeah. We found out that they were planning on sending another fleet in, but as soon as they started hearing the screamings from everybody about how they were getting torn apart, that fleet was recalled, which was nice for us because our battleships were actually running low on torpedoes at that point. They only had, by most accounts, only 3 more volleys of torpedoes. If that, most of the frigates and destroyers had already run dry. Which is why we have our new torpedo frigates, and here's a picture of one. As you can see by the exploded view here, this thing is designed specifically for that. There's almost no other weapons on it except for some short-range defensive weapons. This thing is crazy scary to the enemy because it can pump out an incredible amount of torpedoes. All of them armored, all of them guided, all of them ready to go right up your nose and up any other orifice it might find. Also, we have here detailed plans of their own military. As it turns out, they put a whole lot into this, and they're concerned that if they don't get their fleets back, they might be open to invasion from another group. You know what I say? Fuck them. So anyways, for right now, most of our tactics are being double-checked and triple-checked at this point because you always double-check. It never hurts to double-check, ever. So, cadets, do you have any additional questions? We are getting short on time here. Does anybody have any more questions? A few hands raised. All right, you, right there. The young female stands up. Sir, I just was wondering, we've been hearing rumors that the galactic community outside of our sectors are withdrawing. And would that mean a drawdown as far as military? That's a good question, Cadet. Have a seat. Now, you all know that I keep you all informed as best I can, so it doesn't leave this room. As it stands now, many of the other species out there, the sentient species that were working with us to try and bring a peaceful solution, have actually left. They're scared to death of us. They don't want anything to do with us. They've actually given us word to stay out of their sectors, which of course we have no problems with. Very few have elected to stay, but you can actually see the fear in their eyes when they talk to us. If they have any type of aggressive stance, they are immediately checked by one of their compatriots. It's actually kind of funny to watch. However, you need to understand that you don't need to laugh in their face. That they're basically at this point, Bronze Age, looking at somebody in the Middle Age and going, oh crap, these people can totally screw me over if I, smart off. Okay, that's fine. Just understand the difference here. And they do. Unfortunately, at this point, we only have one true trading partner that trades in different materials. We don't trade in the sciences. It is to be clear that if one of their scientists shows up, they're to be immediately detained and brought forward to command. Okay, we do not share our technology with anyone. Okay, those energy cannons we were using on the turrets, that is classified technology. The way we assemble our turrets, classified technology. And what do you think the nanite bomb's classification is? Classified, sir. You bet your ass. Okay, because OPSEC is still a thing, especially now that everyone around the galactic community looks at us with fear. We just held off 2 separate fleets and we barely took a scratch. Now, they thought that taking out the Ptoa was hard. The Ptoa was not a purpose-built warship. And the fact that it even survived was almost a fluke. Now we have purpose-built battleships. And we even have 4 actual dreadnoughts. There's a gas blowing the room. Oh, you didn't hear about that. Well, you're going to hear about it soon enough. I think I have a small picture. Yes, I have one. Okay, this is a base schematic. This has no extras in it. This is for size comparison. Okay, if you watch the screen, I'm gonna put them next to each other. Okay, there's gasps along the room as the cadets realize that the new dreadnoughts will be covered stem to stern in weapons and are 4.5 times the size of their current battleship. Sir, a hand is up in the back. Yes, cadet. The cadet stands up. Sir, wouldn't this why don't we just make a space station? With that, the cadet next to him slapped him on the hip, telling him he should shut up. No, it's fine. You got to keep everything in mind. It's hard to keep everything up front in your mind, but understand that static defenses are the graveyards of armies. These new dreadnoughts, if what I'm hearing is true, they will be basically moving space stations. They will be able to adjust their positions so that we do not have static defenses beyond our satellites. Thankfully, we've never had to test our satellite grid against anything, which is splendid because I don't know how well it would have stood up against that fleet, really. I mean, they're good, don't get me wrong. They're just, by today's standard, they're antiques. Now, does anybody else have any questions? Okay, last one. He's pointing at one cadet holding his hand up. The cadet stands up. Sir, with this new ships, are we getting into an aggressive stance, sir? That's a very good question, cadet. Sit down. I'm going to answer it. You all need to understand this. The price of peace is eternal vigilance. And with that, I'm going to end the class with the same phrase you've heard ever since you came in. Si vis pacem, parabellum. If you want peace, be prepared for war. Now, we have, to this point, in the galactic community, have never gone out to start a fight. But you bet your ass we will always finish it. The instructor looked at his watch and realized that it was about 10 minutes before these students need to be to their next class. I'll end it here. So get ready. Class dismissed. Everyone simply stood up and stopped. This was a sign of respect as they did not leave before the instructor. The instructor quickly put everything back in his briefcase, closed everything down, and within less than a minute, he was already heading for the door. He raised his hand slightly on the out to make sure nobody sounded off really quick. It's like, as you were, as he walked out.